The man you see in front of you obviously is Ted Cruz, and this particular clip from Meet the Press with Chuck Todd basically is a commentary on Mr. Cruz's thoughts on replacing the recently deceased Anton Scalia. I had no love for Scalia. As a matter of fact, Scalia was a racist. That's just it in a nutshell. I mean, his recent comments about the black people being inferior to white people and that they should go to lesser schools basically cemented me in on that one. But that being said, you know, the man's gone, the man's gone. Mr. Cruz, the constitutionalist, everything must be according to the Constitution, basically just revealed how much that he really does love the Constitution. He's railed against President Obama as far as trying to legislate rather than to perform his executive duties. But his comments, as you will see, show that he is not really for allowing the president to exercise his full executive authority. He's more for the legislature restricting the executive authority of the president by now allowing him to use what is clearly a presidential power, the ability to name a Supreme Court justice.
Let me go to litmus tests. Do you have them for potential Supreme Court justices?
Well, my litmus test for any Supreme Court justice is whether he or she will faithfully apply the Constitution and the law. It's not a specific issue. It is rather a jurisprudential approach. And the only way to determine that is if they have a proven record, if they have spent years demonstrating they'll be faithful to the law. That's the job of a justice. It's what liberal activists don't do. Liberal activists want to instead legislate from the bench. And you know, a perfect example of that is Justice Scalia. Justice Scalia was a lion of the Supreme Court. He was one of the greatest Supreme Court justices in history, spent 3 decades on the court. But before he was on the court, he was a law professor for many, many years. He was a Court of Appeals judge. He had a long proven record so that you knew exactly what you were getting with Justice Scalia. I knew Justice Scalia for 20 years.
Yeah, is this the mistake you think that was made with John Roberts? Because you were a big supporter of him.
Of course it is.
But in hindsight, you're not. Is that because you think that he didn't have a track record?
He didn't have a track record, and I would not have nominated John Roberts. Once George Bush nominated him, I supported the nomination as a Republican nominee. But I would have nominated Mike Luttig, my former boss, who was a Court of Appeals judge, who was Justice Scalia's very first law clerk, and like Mike Luttig, and like Justice Scalia, had a long proven track record. And Chuck...
See, now, Ted Cruz is a liar. He pushed John Roberts. He pushed him. Now, as far as Scalia is concerned, Scalia, the constitutionalist, turned around and interjected his own personal views as far as the election that brought Bush into office, because he turned around and took the ability for states to make their own determinations by telling Florida that they could not do a recount. And that ability is nowhere mentioned within the Constitution. There is no law or statement in the Constitution that allows the federal government to restrict a state from counting a vote in a presidential election or any other. So Mr. Scalia became an activist judge for that election, which threw the election obviously over to Bush. But let's continue.
Just as Ronald Reagan was to the presidency, so Antonin Scalia was to the Supreme Court. He had that big an impact. And I think his passing yesterday really underscores the stakes of this election. We are facing our fundamental rights in a balance.
Let me ask you, does the United States Senate have an obligation to at least consider a nomination that President Obama puts forward? I understand that you guys don't want it and you would prefer to let the election, but doesn't the United States Senate have an obligation to at least go through the process and have an up or down vote?
Not remotely.
What?
Okay. The president nominates Supreme Court justices, and the Senate advises and consents to that nomination. So they do have an obligation to give an up or down vote. But because this is going to be highly partisan, and everybody knows that a Democrat is going to nominate a progressive, liberal, whatever you want to call it, a left-leaning judge, and a left-leaning judge will completely change the fabric of the court. And these Republicans are clawing to stop a left-leaning judge from being nominated and placed on the Supreme Court. So Ted Cruz, the constitutionalist, got this one wrong.
It has been 80 years since a Supreme Court vacancy was nominated and confirmed in an election year. There is a long tradition that you don't do this in an election year. And what this means, Chuck, is we ought to make the 2016 election a referendum on the Supreme Court. I cannot wait to stand on that debate stage with Hillary Clinton or Bernie Sanders and talk about what the Supreme Court will look at like depending on who wins. If Hillary Clinton or Bernie Sanders wins, or for that matter, if Donald Trump wins, whose record is indistinguishable from them on a great many issues, then we will see the Second Amendment written out of the Constitution. Another thing we'll see, and this is very relevant.
That's bullshit. Nobody's getting rid of the Second Amendment. And thank God we will not see you on the debate stage with, hopefully it's Bernie Sanders and not Hillary Clinton.
For conservatives in South Carolina, if Donald Trump is the nominee or if Hillary Clinton is the president, we will see unlimited abortion on demand throughout this country.
Wrong.
Partial birth abortion, taxpayer funding, no parental notification.
Wrong.
And we'll also see our religious liberty torn down.
All right, but I want to go back.
Wrong.
I want to go back to the United States Senate here. So you believe the presidency is only 3 years long in each term? I mean, if we go down this road, we're cutting off a presidency with a year to go. And more importantly, Senator Cruz, the risk here for conservatives is that if you have all these 4-4 ties in the court, then the more liberal-leaning circuits will then have, their rulings will take precedent.
Look, the consequence of a 4-4 tie is that the judgment of the Court of Appeals is affirmed by an equally divided vote. This has happened many times in history that there have been vacancies, sometimes on a closely contentious case. They'll hold it over for the next term when the replacement justice arrives. In an election year, we have a long tradition that a lame duck president doesn't get to jam a Supreme Court nominee through in the very end. LBJ tried that, and the Supreme Court rejected it. And particularly when the court is fought.
And look what happened then. When LBJ didn't get a liberal justice placed on the court, Nixon came in behind him and placed a conservative on the court, and we've basically been screwed ever since. So now is the time. Obama's going to place a nominee in there, and then we as a people better fight like hell to push the Senate into at least running through the process and hopefully confirming them.
Four is balanced. An Obama liberal nominee would dramatically shift the U.S.
Supreme Court. But why not go through the process? Shouldn't the United States Senate do its duty and go through the process? Reject it, Senator, but go through the process.
By the way, the Senate's duty is to advise and consent. You know what? The Senate is advising right now. We're advising that a lame duck president in an election year is not going to be able to tip the balance of the Supreme Court, that we're going to have an election. And if liberals are so confident that the American people want unlimited abortion on demand, want religious liberty torn down, want the Second Amendment taken away, want veterans memorials torn down, want the crosses and stars of David sandblasted off of the tombstones of our fallen veterans.
He is a racist motherfucker. I hate Ted Cruz. All he knows is to spew rhetoric. This fucking guy is not even a U.S. citizen. He's a goddamn Canadian. And he's been against. If Obama said the sky was blue, he'd have to say that the sky wasn't blue. This Tea Party motherfucker needs to be a one-term senator and hopefully get his ass kicked out of office, because nobody is 100% right, nobody's 100% wrong. But basically what he just said is that the president should only have authority to support a Supreme Court justice 3 out of the 4 years that he is in office. And that's not what the Constitution says, Mr. Constitutionalist.
Then go and make the case to the people. I don't think the American people want that. I'm very happy to take that case directly to Hillary Clinton, directly to Bernie Sanders. And I would note, look, how do we know Donald Trump's record on this is going to be bad? He has supported liberals for 4 decades, Jimmy Carter, John Kerry, Hillary Clinton, Chuck Schumer, Harry Reid. Anyone who cares about judges would not be supporting Harry Reid and Chuck Schumer and John Kerry and Hillary Clinton. And the consequence is, if either Hillary or Bernie or Donald Trump is the president, we will see the Second Amendment written out of the Constitution. This is a basic question, who will defend our liberties?
Senator Cruz, I have to leave it there this morning.
See, and that's a bunch of bullshit. Nobody's writing the Second Amendment out of the Constitution. So, you know, he's just spewing rhetoric, trying to fire up his guys. Now, I will tell you this. He's not the only one that has said this. And I'm going to play, I guess, a clip from Rubio. But just so that you know, Schumer, back in the Bush administration, when Bush was in his first term, getting ready to go to his second term, but he had 17 months to go before the election, Schumer said the same thing on the other side, that Bush should not appoint a Supreme Court justice, and that he should allow the election, which is going to be 17 months away before a new president was put in place, if it wasn't him, that a Supreme Court justice shouldn't be nominated or approved. Now, the difference between those two things is Schumer said that they should not confirm a Supreme Court justice, which means the president would nominate him and that it would go through the process, but that they would shoot it down. Ted Cruz is saying that the president basically shouldn't even put a nomination in. So in my mind, that's more egregious. Now here's a section with Marco Rubio basically saying pretty much the same thing as Cruz, but I believe that he basically gave allowance for the nomination to come in, but that it was going to be shot down. So anyway, here's here's Rubio's commentary.
Back earlier this morning, I was joined by Senator Marco Rubio of Florida and Governor John Kasich of Ohio. And I started with Senator Rubio asking him whether the Senate has an obligation to give the president's Supreme Court nominee an up or down vote.
We have an obligation to do it, but not now. The term of the Supreme Court is already, they just started it, but it's not all year long. The court can function with 8 justices. It does it all the time, especially when justices have to recuse themselves. For example, Kagan had to recuse herself early in her term because she just left the administration. We're going to have an election in November where this vacancy is going to be an item of debate and voters are going to get to weigh in. So I just don't think it's wise, and there's precedent for this, for a president nearing the last few months of his administration to put someone on the court that may be there for 30 years.
So you don't think that, I understand that, and I understand the decision that you may not support, and that the Republican majority doesn't want this, but aren't they obligated to at least go through the motions here? I mean, you're saying don't even go through the motions. Why?
Correct. Well, we will go through the motions, but not while Barack Obama's in the White House.
Well, why? I mean, do presidential terms end after 3 years? I mean, that's what I don't understand is why not go through the advice and consent? You don't have to approve it. You can reject it. That's what happened in '68. But why not go through this process?
Because there's actually, it's not just for the Supreme Court, even for appellate courts. It's been, both parties have followed this precedent. There comes a point in the last year of the president, especially in their second term, where you stop nominating or you stop the advice and consent process. You basically say, at this point, with a few months left in your term, no accountability from the ballot box on the appointment you're going to make on a lifetime appointment.
11
That's
months.
The important thing here. These are. These are not laws that can be...
I understand that, but...
Yeah, right, but these are not laws that can be reversed. In essence, this is a lifetime appointment to the highest court in the country. at a time when the balance of the Constitution and the court's interpretation of it is at stake. We're not moving forward on it. Mitch McConnell's already made that very clear. I support it 100%. Here's the bottom line. I don't trust Barack Obama on the appointment of Supreme Court justices. We cannot afford to have Scalia replaced by someone like the nominees he's put there in the past.
And he told it. He cannot support any justice that Barack Obama puts into place. So it's not about the justice that's being put into place. It's about Barack Obama. And he has just stated what has been obvious about the obstructionist nature of Republicans when it comes to anything that Barack Obama wants to do.
We're going to have an election. There's going to be a new president. I believe it's going to be me. And we're going to look for someone that most resembles Scalia to replace him.
All right.
And it will not, thank God, be you. And here is the trifecta. John Kasich speaking about the same issues as far as the replacing the Supreme Court justice.
Joined now by the fourth presidential candidate we've had on the show this morning, Republican Governor of Ohio, John Kasich. Welcome back to Meet the Press, sir.
Always, if it's Sunday, it's like Meet the Press.
I appreciate that,
isn't it?
Well, I've had two U.S. senators on this morning who say that the U.S. Senate shouldn't even bother considering a nomination that President Obama puts up. Does the U.S. Senate have an obligation to at least consider it, hold a hearing, and if they vote it down, they vote it down? But should the U.S. Senate, should Mitch McConnell at least open up that part of the process?
Well, that's their decision, Chuck. As the governor of Ohio, I have to deal with legislators and their decisions, and I don't try to tell them what to do. I do think that really the president, I understand the president has prerogative here. I got that. Senate has a prerogative too, of course, but I just think at a time when the country is so divided, it would just be great if the president didn't send somebody forward and we had an election, and then everybody would be clear about what they want in the next Supreme Court justice. But I guess it's not going to go that way.
It's a roll of the dice.
It's just going to cause...
Governor, it's a roll of the dice. You could have a Democratic Senate,
a
Democratic president, and come in and then have a more liberal justice than what President Obama might provide.
Well, but that's life. I mean, then the people actually have had some say. It's really kind of a unique thing when you think about it, Chuck. It's unique to say that the public itself is going to have sort of an indirect vote on who's going to be a Supreme Court justice. I think that's kind of cool. And what I don't like now is, we could talk about this all day long. You and I both know in the real world, they're not going to confirm anybody unless they pick somebody who's so beloved that everybody goes, that's great, okay?
And that's absolutely true. They're not going to confirm anybody that Obama puts in there. But at least he's saying that they should run through the process. At least I believe that's what he's saying.
I don't think that's going to happen.
Yeah, you're probably right on that. Let me move to the debate.
Anyway, that's just the quick couple of clips on how constitutionally aware and following the Republican candidates are when it comes to the powers of the legislative branch versus the executive branch, and how partisan things are. And granted, Scalia was as far right as anybody has been in the history of the court, and getting him off the Supreme Court to many will be, is a blessing. And now we can just get the right left-leaning judge in there. I believe a lot of the power will be brought back to the people.